Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, there was an interesting little, you never know if it's hyperbole or if it's something of a serious note, where President-elect Trump talked about bringing together China and the United States in a sort of G2 to rule over the world, for better lack of the term. This, ironically, is not new, and it's something that I think we should delve into. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this great discussion. And, it's fascinating that this goes back to the end of the great financial crisis, the GFC in 2009, and now is being resurrected once again.
Yeah, well, obviously, thanks for joining me as well, Ken. You came up with a great idea. We think there's a lot of mileage in discussing this, and you're absolutely right. There was the historical context, and this came about largely, and this isn't well understood by people, although I think increasingly it has been in the last few years, that effectively China bailed out the West. China was responsible for stopping the West collapsing in 2008-9. That story was hidden because people in the West were not allowed to be aware of this, but it most certainly was the case. And I think there was some kind of feeling at that point, bearing in mind this was pre the Xi era, where there could have been more integration. And this was not everybody in Beijing and the government's belief, but there wasn't more so back then than there certainly is now. What I would call more pro-Atlanticists in the Chinese administration who kind of had this idea of it was difficult to ascertain what the belief was at that point in time, but some more serious integration in some capacity between the United States and China, and clearly that kind of fizzled away pretty quickly. And when Xi became president, it just died out because the intention then was very clear that China was not going to get into some kind of partnership with the United States to the detriment of what you might call multipolarity in the rest of the developing world, the global south, etc. So there is this historical context, and it's interesting, and we'll come on to why we think Trump is making this statement at this point in time and what the Chinese response was and is going to be going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting because it goes back, as you mentioned, where China had to bail out the West in the largest capacity. And while the proposal of a G2 between the United States and China really didn't get at least academic traction until about 2016, the start of Trump's first term, it does go back to there were a lot of talks and rumblings about this in May of 2009. But ironically, then Premier Wen Jiabao at the EU-China summit in Prague said that the G2 concept is baseless and wrong. And one of the primary things is that China maintains that world affairs should be decided jointly by all countries, not dictated by one or two countries. And it's interesting because as the West starts to really break apart, the Ukraine conflict could really have a detriment not just to NATO, but the EU. We see what's happening to governments all across Europe right now. The US is going to have a very difficult time using this large bloc of the US and Europe to face Russia, the BRICS nations, the African question, what's going on in West Asia. The US could very quickly find themselves isolated in this and trying to take on, continuous hegemony while they failed in what they've done in trying to break apart Russia and China's partnership. And now perhaps they're shifting to want to go to China's side in order to break themselves away from Russia. Who knows? But there's more that we have to go into this, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I would say is if you I mean, bearing in mind, you have to be careful in making any really concrete judgments based on things Trump has said since, he decided to stand to be president again. He's now been elected president. There's a lot of pre-election noise and sentiment coming out to get re-elected. But one thing that was very clear is there was this idea from the United States' perspective that we will have to move away from the idea of some kind of military conflict with China, not to go to war directly with China, which is certainly something we saw very self-evidently during the Biden administration with all the provocation, but to kind of drag them into a proxy, we'll get them to invade Taiwan and we'll try and cripple China then with sanctions by telling the world China's this aggressor, and trying to basically do to China what they tried to do with Russia and failed via the Ukraine war for exactly the same reason that Russia went to war with Ukraine. Look, they're the aggressor. We have to sanction them. Europe, of course, followed suit, but unsurprisingly, the global south refused to do so. So there seemed to be some indication of a move away from that. It's difficult to know what Trump's foreign policy will be with regards to China and so what they call the Indo-Pacific, which is the Asia Pacific. And that relates to things like this whole AUKUS, which is Australia, the United Kingdom, the US, which to all intents and purposes is just the US selling nuclear submarines to Australia in like 10 years when they're ready. It's pretty meaningless. There's a Quad line, which has never really got off the ground. It includes India, obviously South Korea, and that again is being pretty muted and not really achieved any traction whatsoever. So the question is, and Trump made this statement that effectively he was looking to impose enormous tariffs on the Chinese. And it's well documented, and we've said this, and I don't want to go into reams of detail about it again, why imposing tariffs on China is a disaster. It's just highly inflationary for the United States, as we know. And it's not going to do anything in terms of, this much vaunted idea that the US can reindustrialize. But I'm not going to go into that again because we've discussed it previously, but more we want to focus, okay, if Trump's genuinely serious about China and the United States forming this G2, which from a Chinese perspective is as irrelevant today in 2024 as it was a decade ago or more, when Chinese flatly refused to entertain the idea. But it suggests and implies from the US perspective an admission they can't defeat China. They can't have a war with China because China's militarily too strong, because there's never going to be a ground war with China. It would straight away descend into a nuclear war. And China's nuclear technology is far in advance of the United States. Therefore, and at best, it will be mutually assured destruction. So that's not an option. They've also, I think, finally starting to realize they can't defeat China economically, that putting enormous tariffs on Chinese goods is not going to be detrimental to China whatsoever, that China's exports to the United States is a very small percentage of China's overall GDP. So if China doesn't export to the United States, so what? But if, from the Chinese perspective, but for the US, they would have enormous problems, because where are they going to source the goods they require? They can't do that. They might be able to do it in 5 or 10 years, but that doesn't solve the problem in the here and now. So it implies, from Trump's perspective, a realization, well, we can't defeat China economically, can't defeat them militarily. And previously, it seemed very clear that the United States' intention was to get Russia on board and to try and effectively get them as a chosen ally to try and ultimately break the relationship between China and Russia, or in this case, by virtue of what we just said, Russia and China. I think there's a realization now given Trump has come out and made his statement, I'll end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. I think he realizes that's not reality, that Russia is not going to roll over. And therefore, the war will carry on until Russia achieves the objectives it believes it needs to do so. So now it's all of a sudden could be an indication that they realize trying to prize Russia away from China is not a reality. So I know maybe instead what we ought to try and do is butter up the Chinese, make them feel as though they're the most important nation in the world along with us, and we'll form this G2 hegemony which would destroy multipolarity, notwithstanding the fact that Chinese don't trust the Americans, would never stab the rest of the world in the back anyway, because it's extremely damaging to the Chinese anyway. But fundamentally, why would China stab Russia in the back? I mean, because people don't understand the dynamic of that relationship. It's extremely important for both nations. Yes, people will say, well, China, it's basically all one way and China gets everything it wants. Well, China needs what Russia gives it. It needs dirt cheap energy. And Russia can sell dirt cheap energy and still make a huge profit. So, and that's not the only part of their relationship in any way, shape, or form. They very much complement each other in foreign policy, where one works in one country, say in Africa, the Russians are moving into Africa as well as the Chinese. And in other situations in South America, to some degree in West Asia, etc., etc. So that relationship is watertight. It's the strongest relationship between two countries in the world today, and arguably throughout history, or certainly history that we can comprehend in the last 2,000 years or whatever, and maybe beyond, because that relationship is the backbone and fulcrum of multipolarity. They're not going to sacrifice that relationship for anything, because ultimately both know that the United States wants to prize one off the other. They want to weaken one of the countries, and then in the process, eventually, if they did have this G2 with China, they tear that up and then try to rule as an hegemonic power again. So China has no need for this, but I think it's indicative of the fact that the United States thinks now, well, Russia's a lost cause. And there's no doubt, and I'm not saying this is Trump's perspective, but in the US, there's still, despite the abject failure of the Ukraine war from their perspective, still harbors ideas of getting rid of Putin, of balkanizing Russia, and effectively going in and stealing all Russian assets, because Russia has the biggest resource base in the world by some distance, and it's hardly scratched the surface in terms of utilizing those resources. The resource base is probably at least 50 to 60% larger than they currently have, and maybe even more significant than that. So that could be the angle with this, but it's implying a realization inside Washington now. And it kind of goes back to the fact of that the statements that came out from the transition team with respect to US-China policy, where they kind of went, well, you can only put tariffs on for so long. Otherwise they lose their impact. You can only sanction so much, and in the end, countries will find a way around the sanctions. So then you have to have a different approach. And it could be this also a realization that they're going to heavily depend on China in the future for massive investment to help rebuild the country, that they're going to need China to invest enormously in the reindustrialization of the United States to make it a reality. And they simply can't do this on their own. And, I think it's one of those statements that Trump will float the idea, put it out there without it being an official policy statement. And he's still not officially the US president, so he could say all manner of things. And just to see what the consensus is, or if there's any noise coming out of China that sounds remotely sympathetic or encouraging that perspective. But why would China do this? Because just because it's not the Biden administration anymore doesn't mean suddenly China's going to trust the United States. The bottom line is, in the world, no one trusts the United States, not even its allies. But most of its allies are terrified of upsetting the United States. But the relationship is built on fear, not on trust.
Yeah, it's fascinating because something I had been rattling around for a little bit. The U.S. obviously used Europe as a proxy, a front man in its proxy war against Russia. But in many ways, China has the power and the patience to use Europe against the United States because Europe is far more reliant upon China to save their economy than they are in being forced to buy U.S. LNG, to buy U.S. goods, etc. The fascinating thing is when you take a look at it, the European Union goes after any company that has innovation and is big because their own companies no longer are capable. They have put so much regulation, they have put so much restrictions, they have put so much ideological dogma into the EU as a whole that no companies really can get big enough anymore to compete with what is in China, what is in the United States. So if you're going to remain under as a vassal to the US or potentially be a partner with China, a choice is going to have to be made. And if that's the case, if European nations start falling like dominoes, moving to the side of China and the multipolar world, then the US becomes more and more isolated rather than the hegemony where they can dictate everything around the world and force nations to comply to their whims and desires, and it's all about protecting their corporations and their it reminds me of something that Blinken mentioned just a few days ago at the Council of Foreign Relations confab, where he was asked about regime change, and he admittedly, yeah, the U.S. Does constant attempts at regime change, but they have actually, especially when it comes to Iran, over the last 20 years, our experiments in regime change have not had resounding successes. We already know that with Afghanistan. We know this with a number of different other countries. So with that being said, and you pointed this out many times, the world is recognizing how much of a paper tiger the United States is, and their bombastic demands and claims about the tariffs that were put on to and the sanctions that were put on Iran, to Russia, to whomever, are really meaningless in the whole scheme of things. And they are destroying the West as a whole because they are creating animosity with member states that should be equal trade partners rather than seen as adversaries and somebody to bend to your will for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a great point in mentioning Europe in the context of this, because if, for argument's sake, and not that there's any reason to suggest it will ever happen, if China was to agree to this, I think they would have to have taken total leave of their senses, which I simply don't believe to be the case. But let's work on the basis that this became a reality. What does that mean for Europe? I mean, effectively, there's an argument to say, well, what the United States would then do is this would be like also just not only stabbing the Europe in the back, which they already have done effectively by enforcing sanctions that is crippling Europe because of a lack of access to cheap Russian energy. But the argument could be that in this situation, then the United States would totally throw Europe under the bus in having this relationship with China. And it could be a situation where the United States is genuinely looking at Europe now and going, well, we've pushed this button too far. Europe's just a total mess. I mean, it's falling apart. Countries are in terminal decline. Even, the Germanys, the Frances, the Italys, the Northern European countries are in serious trouble. I mean, and therefore, on that basis, we might have gutted them to the point where, well, there's not much business for us with Europe in the future. I mean, we might want to force them to buy our energy, but we might find we got them so badly they don't need the energy anymore the way they did. And if we try to tariff Europe into oblivion, we might just completely destroy it. And then there might be this argument: well, if we do that, what does that mean for Europe's position in NATO? What does it mean then in the future because Europe's a neighbor of Russia? And this is the problem when you make these policy decisions. And you can then go, let's have a G2. But all this would do ultimately as well is throw, I think, Europe into the arms, ironically, of the Russians, and to an extent also China. And it could be a situation where Trump thinks, well, if we work together, we can use China's money, we can use China's technological advancements, and we can then carve up the world and make it work for both of us. And we'll get 95% of the pie, and the rest of the world will just have to suffer the ignominy of being in this kind of weird unipolar world, which is China and us against everyone else. But they again haven't thought through the consequences. Ultimately, this will force Europe to have to turn its back on the United States, which inevitably at some point it will end up doing so. It might take a long time, and it might take pain on a level we just couldn't comprehend they could be prepared to suffer, but it could happen. So in all these situations, there's never a great deal of thought applied other than we can do this, we can dominate. But the fallout of the Ukraine war is going to damage US-European relation immensely. Whether it can survive that and given the fallout of what the consequences are going to be for a war that the West has failed. Look at Europe admitting, von der Leyen, they've spent 130 billion euros, which probably means at least 150 or 180 billion euros on Ukraine. And it's been a total failure. And in fact, they've contributed more in percentage terms in providing weapons to Ukraine than the Americans have. As though that's cheerleading failure, but this is the kind of the ramifications and the fallout of what's coming. So, I mean, and ultimately it'll come to the point where Europe simply won't be able to buy US energy. They won't be able to afford to buy it. They'll need the cheapest option, which is certainly not going to be the United States. And the US can't guarantee long-term supplies of energy anyway. But the energy subject's something we'll park for another discussion. But it's part of this whole makeup that the United States is just thrashing around trying to stay relevant and trying to go from one failed policy decision to another and trying to jump into bed with the Chinese is not going to work. And then China can rightly point out to the Europeans, you were going to be thrown under the bus. And the Americans want to throw you under the bus. So you need to join the Eurasian camp, which means you need to join us and Russia and Iran and the world that can provide you with cheap energy. And we can build partnerships that will hopefully at some point in the future resurrect the fortunes of Europe. So, but I do feel it's a desperate move, and the US is beginning to realize that they can't defeat China. So maybe it's better if we try to be friends with them. But the problem is, if China just flatly rejects the US's overtures, then there's going to be a really negative response because the US cannot handle rejection. It can't handle being humiliated. And it normally does something rather idiotic when it faces that degree of humiliation and rejection, which they've been increasingly suffering for a number of years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think a good way to end this is to go back to the Mao era in the 1950s, where China promoted an alternative through its five principles of peaceful coexistence, which was mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non aggression, non interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. My gosh, we're talking about the multipolar world today. Paul, as always, want to thank you for being a part of this great discussion and for your insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you very much for your support. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, send this out to anybody you think would be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.